I still count things when I'm scared. Silly habit. Lamp posts, buttons, the number of steps up to a door. My mum used to say it was my way of holding the world still. And on the morning I'm about to tell you about, I counted 41 guardsmen's brass buttons before anything went wrong. 41. I remember it exactly. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for this story, but I'll tell you anyway because I want you to trust me. It's Margaret. Most people call me Meg. I taught primary school in Leeds for 32 years, and then I retired, and then my husband passed, and then I decided that sitting in a quiet house was a slow way to disappear. So when my granddaughter Poppy turned 9, I booked us both a little trip to London. Just the two of us. Her mum could barely believe I'd manage it. "You'll lose her in the crowds, Mum," she said. I told her I'd manage. I always manage. We came down on a Thursday. The train was late, of course. Poppy pressed her face against the window the whole way and narrated every field, every cow, every canal boat like she was doing a nature documentary. By the time we reached King's Cross, she'd talked herself hoarse, and I loved her for it. The next morning was the day. A Friday in late June. And here's the thing about that particular Friday, it was hot. Properly hot. Not the sticky gray London warmth you sometimes get, but a clean bright heat, the kind that makes the whole city squint. The pavements gave off that dusty smell, that warm stone smell, and everyone had their sleeves rolled up and their sunglasses on, and there was this feeling in the air like the whole city had decided to be in a good mood. We got to Buckingham Palace at about 9:30. Early on purpose. I'd read that if you wanted a good spot for the changing of the guard, you had to get there before the crowds thickened. And Poppy, well, she'd been asking about the guards for weeks. She had it in her head that they weren't real, that they were statues or actors or robots dressed up. She'd seen a video online, some tourist waving their hand in front of a guardsman's face, and the guard not moving, not blinking, and she was convinced there was a trick to it. "Nan," she said, tugging my sleeve, "how do they not move? For real, how?" "Discipline," I said. "They're trained." "But what if a bee lands on their nose?" "They stay still." "What if they need a wee?" "Poppy." She grinned up at me, gap-toothed, and I couldn't help laughing. We found our spot near the railings. The gold-tipped railings, all curls and points, warm to the touch by then. And there he was, one of the guards, standing just inside at his post in that tall bearskin hat and the red tunic that looks almost too bright to be real, like someone turned the color up. He was young. You could tell even from a distance. Something about the smoothness of his jaw, the way he held himself, not stiff exactly, but held like a bowstring pulled and waiting. And Poppy, bless her, marched right up to the railings and stared at him like he was an exhibit. I want to describe him properly because he matters. He was tall but not enormous. Fair-skinned, a little sunburn across the cheekbones already, which told me he'd been out in it a while. His eyes were pale gray or maybe a washed-out blue, I couldn't be sure. And they didn't move. That was the thing that got me too, if I'm honest. They just held, fixed on some point past all of us, past the crowd, past the road, like he was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. I counted his buttons. That's when I got 41. Twice, to be sure, 41. Now you have to understand the scene. It wasn't just us. By 10 o'clock the pavement was packed, tourists from everywhere. I heard German and something that might have been Portuguese, and a big loud group of Americans in matching baseball caps who kept asking each other if this was the one where the horses come out. There were kids on their dad's shoulders. A woman selling little Union Jack flags on sticks. A busker somewhere down the road murdering a Beatles song on an out-of-tune guitar. Ice cream vans. Pigeons, always the pigeons, fat and fearless, waddling between people's feet. And the sound. That's what I remember most about the before, the sound of a happy crowd. It has a texture to it, a kind of warm hum, hundreds of little conversations layered on top of each other, laughter breaking through here and there. You don't notice it while it's happening. You only notice it later when it's gone, when it stops. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Poppy waved at the guard. Of course she did. She stood there with her whole arm going back and forth like a windscreen wiper, and she called out, Hello, can you hear me? He didn't move. Nan, he's not real. He's real, love. He's just doing his job. His job is standing still. His job, I said, and I remember choosing the words carefully because a few other people were listening and smiling, is to guard, to be steady, so that everyone else can feel safe. She thought about that. She had a way of thinking where her whole face scrunched up. That's a boring job, she decided. A man next to us laughed. He was older, silver-haired, a proper Londoner by the sound of him, the kind who talks to strangers at bus stops. "It's harder than it looks, sweetheart," he said to her. "My nephew did it. The training, you'd cry." "I wouldn't cry," Poppy said, offended. "You would," he said cheerfully. "Everyone cries." I liked him, that man. I never got his name. I've thought about him a lot since. The changing ceremony started around then. You hear it before you see it, the band. Drums first, that steady thump you feel in your chest before your ears catch up, and then the brass coming in and the whole crowd sort of turns as one, phones lifting into the air like a field of little glowing flowers. The new guard came marching in through the gates, that slow, deliberate march, boots crunching in perfect time, and the crowd made that noise crowds make, the ooh, the collective breath. Poppy stopped talking. That's how you know a 9-year-old is impressed. She went dead quiet and just watched, mouth slightly open. I watched our guard, the young one. During the whole ceremony he didn't so much as twitch. The band played, the boots crunched, a pigeon actually landed near his feet and pecked around and he didn't look down. And I found myself wondering about him, who he was, whether he'd wanted this or whether he'd fallen into it, whether he had a mum somewhere watching a live stream proud, whether he was hot. He must have been so hot in all that wool in that sun. I could feel sweat gathering at the back of my own neck, and I was in a cotton blouse. There was one moment, and I only caught it because I was starring, where a bead of sweat ran down the side of his face from his temple right down past his jaw. And he didn't wipe it, didn't blink, just let it fall. And something about that, this tiny helpless human thing happening on a face that was trying so hard to be made of stone, it moved me. I don't know why. I got a bit teary, honestly, over a bead of sweat. Silly old woman. The ceremony wound down. The crowd started to loosen, the way crowds do, people peeling off toward the park, toward the cafes, toward the tube. But a good number stayed. It was too nice a day to rush anywhere. Poppy wanted an ice cream. Naturally. There was a van parked up the road a bit, toward the corner where the mall opens out, near the edge of the park. I said fine, one ice cream, and no, we are not getting the one with the chocolate flake and the sprinkles and the sauce. We are getting a normal one. We started walking, and here's a detail I keep coming back to. As we walked away from the railings, I glanced back at the guard one more time. I don't know why, just an instinct. And I swear I know how this sounds, I swear his eyes moved. Just for a second, they flicked, toward the road, toward the corner, away from his fixed point. I told myself I imagined it. Guards don't do that. That's the whole thing about them, isn't it? They don't do that. But he did, I saw it. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. Because whatever he saw it before any of us did, before the rest of the world caught up. There was a stillness in him in that instant that was different from the trained stillness. It was the stillness of an animal that has heard something in the dark. We got to the ice cream van. There was a queue, 4 or 5 people. Poppy was jigging from foot to foot, going on about flakes. The sun was hammering down. Somewhere behind us the band was marching off, the drums fatting. A double-decker bus wheezed past. A child was crying somewhere, that tired, overheated toddler cry. Everything was normal. Everything was so completely, blessedly normal. I checked my watch. It was 11 minutes past 11. I remember because Poppy said, "Look." Nan, all ones, pointing at my old watch face, 11, and she said you're supposed to make a wish. "What did you wish for?" I asked her. She scrunched her face. "Can't tell you, it won't come true." Fair enough. That was the last completely ordinary thing that happened. A little girl making a wish at 11 minutes past 11, on a hot Friday morning in the most famous city in the world. I'll tell you what happened next in a moment, but I need you to hold on to this picture first. The heat, the buttons 41, the bead of sweat, the guard's eyes flicking toward the corner, Poppy's wish. Because everything after this I saw with different eyes, and so will you once I've told you. Hold on to the quiet, it's about to end. Part 1 continues below, the setup deepens. Let me tell you a bit more about the corner, because the corner is where it all happened, and you need to be able to see it. Where the mall meets the edge of the park, there's an open bit. Wide pavement, some big old plane trees throwing dappled shade, a couple of benches, the black railings that run along Green Park. It's a lovely spot. On a hot day, it's where people go to sit down and take their shoes off and let the kids run about a bit on the grass. There were dozens of people there. Families, mostly. A group of teenagers on a school trip in matching high-vis vests with a frazzled teacher trying to count them. An old couple sharing chips. A young mum with a pram, rocking it back and forth with one foot while she scrolled her phone. And there was a van. I didn't clock it at first. Why would I? A white van parked half up on the curb near the trees, a bit awkwardly, but you see that all the time in London, delivery vans, works vans, parked wherever they can squeeze. This one had no markings, just white, a bit grubby. And it had been there, I later learned, for over an hour, which no one thought anything of, because why would you? The guard thought something of it, I know that now. The man beside me in the ice cream queue, different man, younger, holding a toddler, was on his phone, and he said to no one in particular, "Anyone else smell that?" I sniffed. There was a smell, faint, chemical, sharp, like nail varnish or the stuff you strip paint with. Underneath the warm stone smell and the ice cream sweet smell and the pigeon and hot tarmac smell of a London summer, there was this other thing, this wrong thing, and my stomach did a small, strange flip before my brain had any idea why. "Probably the drains," someone said. "In this heat, everything pongs," said someone else. And we all just accepted that. That's the thing about a crowd. A crowd is a herd, and a herd calms itself. Nobody wants to be the one who panics. Nobody wants to be the fool who ran when it was only the drains. So we told ourselves stories. Drains, heat, nothing. And we shuffled forward in the queue, and Poppy got to the front and asked for the ice cream with the flake, and I was too distracted to say no. I keep thinking about how ordinary fear is at the start. It doesn't arrive like they show it in films, with music and slow motion. It arrives as a smell you can't place, and a feeling in your gut you talk yourself out of. It arrives quietly, and it waits, patient, while you buy your granddaughter an ice cream. Poppy got her cone. She was over the moon, chocolate flakes sticking out of it like a little brown chimney. She took a huge bite off the top and got it all round her mouth, and I laughed and wiped her chin with my thumb, the way you do, the way I'd done 100 times. And over her shoulder, past the ice cream van, past the queue, I could see the guard. He'd left his post. Now you need to understand what that means. I didn't then, not fully. But I've read a lot since, and I've spoken to people who know, and I can tell you, a guardsman does not simply walk away from his post. It is one of the most drilled, most sacred rules of the whole institution. You stand. You hold. Whatever happens. There are procedures, there are relief timings, there are ways it's meant to happen, but a guard just breaking away and moving on his own toward the crowd, toward the road. That doesn't happen. It's almost unthinkable. And yet there he was, moving. Not running, not yet, but walking fast, that long-legged, deliberate stride eating up the pavement, his rifle held across his body, his eyes locked on that white van by the trees. People turned to look at him. You could see the confusion ripple out from him as he passed, heads swiveling, a few phones coming up. "Ooh, look, the guard's walking about. That's unusual, get a video." They thought it was part of the show. He knew it wasn't. I put my hand on Poppy's shoulder. I didn't know why. I just needed to feel her there, solid, under my palm. The ice cream was already melting down her wrist. The sun was so bright. The smell was stronger now, or maybe I was just letting myself smell it. and the guard reached the middle of the open space, between the crowd and the van, and he stopped. And he turned to face us, all of us, the whole scattered mass of families and tourists and school kids and old couples with their chips, and he raised one arm, straight out, palm forward in the universal, wordless, unmistakable shape of a single command. Stop. Everything in me went cold in all that heat. I didn't know what was in the van. I didn't know what he knew. But I knew in that second, looking at that young man's face, a face that had held so perfectly still for hours, that hadn't flinched at a pigeon or a bee or a bead of sweat. I knew from the way it wasn't still now, from the fear that was written plain across it, and the way he was mastering that fear, and standing between us and the thing anyway, I knew. Something was very, very wrong. And he was the only one who'd seen it coming. Have you ever watched a crowd change its mind all at once? It's a terrible thing, beautiful almost in how fast it happens, like watching a flock of starlings turn in the sky. 1 second everyone's a person, minding their own business, licking an ice cream, and the next second everyone's part of one single frightened animal. That's what happened when the guard raised his hand. For a moment, a long, awful, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. His arm was out, palm forward, and his mouth was moving. He was shouting something, but the wind and the distance and the general noise ate the first words, and it took a second for them to reach us, and when they did, they landed like stones. Move back, get back now, move. His voice cracked on the last word. He was young, I told you. His voice cracked, and somehow that made it more real, more frightening, than if it had been some deep booming command. Because a booming command sounds like theater. A cracking voice sounds like a person who is terrified and telling you the truth. The crowd broke. I've never seen anything like it, and I hope I never do again. People turned and shoved. Someone screamed, I don't know who, one of those short, sharp screams that sets everyone else off. The teenagers in the high-vis vests scattered, their teacher grabbing at their sleeves, her face white. The young mum with the pram spun it around so hard she nearly tipped it. A man went down, just tripped, went sprawling on the hot pavement, and for one horrible second the crowd was going to trample him, and then 2 strangers hauled him up by the arms and dragged him along. And in the middle of all of it, I stood frozen with my hand on Poppy's shoulder, and the ice cream fell out of her hand and splattered on the ground, the flakes snapping, and she looked up at me with the most confused, betrayed little face, as if the world had broken a promise to her, and she said, Nan. That's what unfroze me, that single word, Nan. I grabbed her, both arms. I pulled her into me and I turned us both away from the van and I started to move, and my legs were shaking so badly I could barely trust them, and I thought, very clearly, in a strange, calm little voice at the back of my head, I am 71 years old and I cannot run and I have to get this child away from here. Behind us the guard was still shouting, still standing there, between the crowd and the van. I have to tell you about the smell now because it got worse, and it's important. As we pushed through the panicking crowd, the smell that had been faint before, that nail varnish paint stripper sharpness, bloomed suddenly stronger, and underneath it there was something sweet, almost pleasant in a sickly way, like almonds, like marzipan. I remember thinking that, absurdly, someone's baking, and then a man near me, running, gasping, said a word I'll never forget. He was maybe 40, in a suit, sweating, and he said it half to himself in pure animal fear. That's a bomb, that's a bloody bomb, I know that smell. I was in the army, that's move, move. Almonds, marzipan, the smell of certain explosives. Apparently, I didn't know that then, I know it now. I've looked it up more times than is healthy. The word bomb went through the crowd like electricity. You didn't even have to hear it clearly. It jumped from person to person, and the panic doubled, and now people weren't just moving. They were fleeing all out, elbows and knees and no mercy. And I clung to Poppy and I put my body between her and everyone else, and I took the shoves on my own shoulders and back, and I kept us moving toward the park railings, toward open ground, away, away, away. I looked back once. I shouldn't have, but I did. The guard hadn't moved. Everyone else was running from the van. He was standing near it, facing it, his back to us. That red tunic like a splash of blood against all that green and gray. He'd stopped shouting, there was no one left near enough to shout at, everyone had scattered and he was just standing there, holding his ground, between the thing and the last few stragglers who hadn't got away yet. And I understood something, in that half-second glance, that I've carried with me ever since. He wasn't standing there because he didn't understand the danger. He was standing there because he understood it completely. He knew exactly what was in that van, or near enough. He'd smelled it before any of us. He'd seen it before any of us. And instead of running, instead of saving himself, which every instinct in a human body screams at you to do, he had walked toward it. He had put himself between the danger and the people. That is what he was for. That is what all that standing still, all that discipline, all those hours of not flinching had been building toward. Not the show, not the tourists' photos. This. He was doing his job, his actual job, the one underneath the ceremony. To guard, to be steady, so that everyone else could feel safe. I'd said those words to Poppy not an hour before, teaching a 9-year-old a nice lesson about a man in a funny hat. I hadn't meant them. Not really. Not like this. Now let me slow down, because in the middle of chaos there were small moments, and it's the small moments that I want you to see. There was a little boy. I noticed him because Poppy did. Even mid-terror, my granddaughter, this soft-hearted child, twisted in my arms and pointed and said, "Nan, the baby's on his own." And she was right. Near the trees, not far from the van, closer to it than anyone else, there was a little boy, 3, maybe 4 years old, in a yellow t-shirt, and he was just standing there in the middle of the emptying space, turning in a slow circle, his face crumpling because he'd lost his mum. In the stampede, somehow, he'd been separated. Maybe her hand slipped from his. Maybe she was knocked one way and he went another. It happens in a fraction of a second. And now the crowd was pouring away from him in every direction. 100 backs turned, everyone running for their own lives, and this tiny boy in a yellow t-shirt was standing alone, 30 feet from a van that smelled of almonds, starting to cry. And I want to be honest with you. I want to be completely honest, because this is a true story and I promised you'd trust me. I didn't go to him. I couldn't. I had Poppy. I had my own child's child in my arms and my old legs barely holding, and every part of me focused on one single task, get her out, and I saw that boy. I saw him clear as day, and I kept moving away. I've had to live with that. It's not as simple as cowardice. I don't think it's cowardice to protect the child in your arms, but I saw him and I didn't go, and I'll carry that. But someone did go. The guard. He'd been standing there back to us, facing the van, holding the line. And I watched. I'd stopped again. God help me. I'd stopped at the railings with Poppy to look back one more time, some instinct making me witness it. I watched him hear the boy. You could see it. His head turned. That head that hadn't turned for a pigeon or a bee. It turned sharp toward the sound of a child crying. And he had a choice. I've thought about this so much. He had maybe 2 seconds and an impossible choice. Stay where he was, holding his position, doing what he'd been trained to do, guarding the empty space, being the steady thing. Or break again, abandon the post a second time, run toward the danger he'd been keeping people away from, to save one small boy who'd been left behind. You already know what he did. You wouldn't be listening to this story if he hadn't. He ran to the boy. Part 2 continues, the second stretch. I need to describe those seconds properly, because they were the longest of my life, and I wasn't even the one living them. He dropped into that sprint they can do, those soldiers, that flat-out fast run, all economy, no wasted motion. His bearskin hat flew off, just came off, tumbled onto the grass, and without it he suddenly looked so much younger, so much more like somebody's son. This young man with short fair hair running toward a van that a soldier in the crowd had said was a bomb. He reached the boy. He didn't slow down. He scooped him one arm the way you'd snatch up a rugby ball, the boy's little legs kicking, the yellow t-shirt bright against the red tunic, and he pivoted on one foot and he ran the other way, toward us, toward the railings, toward safety, carrying a stranger's child against his chest, one big hand cradling the back of that small head the way you do, the way you instinctively protect a child's head. And the whole time I was counting. I told you, I count when I'm scared. And I stood there at the railings with Poppy's face pressed into my chest so she wouldn't see, and I counted the guard's steps as he ran toward us with that boy in his arms, and I got to 11 steps. I remember it was 11, the same as the wish, 11 minutes past 11 steps. And the van went up. I can't really describe the sound. I've tried. It wasn't a bang. That's too small a word. It was a thing you felt in your whole body, in your teeth, in your chest, in the ground under your feet. A great flat wall of noise and heat and force that arrived all at once and knocked me clean off my feet, backwards, still holding Poppy, the pair of us going down onto the grass with the railings above us. And the sky went white, and then black, and then full of things, dust, leaves, bits of tree, bits of van, a hot filthy rain of debris coming down all over everything. My ears stopped working. That's a strange thing. The world went silent, that ringing, muffled, underwater silence, and I lay on the grass with my granddaughter under me and I couldn't hear anything, and I thought, quite calmly, we're alive. I can feel her. She's moving. We're alive. And then slowly the sound came back. In pieces. A car alarm. Then another. Then screaming. The screaming came back last, or maybe I just couldn't bear to hear it first. And smoke. Thick black smoke pouring up where the van had been, and small fires, and the trees stripped bare on one side, and paper, so much paper, and dust, drifting down like gray snow onto everything, onto all of us, in the middle of a beautiful hot June morning in London. I sat up. Poppy was crying, but she was whole, not a scratch. She'd been under me and behind the railings, and I'd taken us down at the right moment, and she was fine, she was fine, she was fine. I held her face in both my hands and I checked, my hands shaking. I checked her all over and she was fine. And then I looked for the guard. The blast had been behind him as he ran. He'd had his back to it, his body between the boy and the van, exactly as he'd been the whole time, his body between the danger and a child. He'd been thrown too, hard, further than us, out across the grass. For a moment I couldn't see him in the smoke and the dust. And my heart, I didn't even know this boy. I'd watched him for one morning. I didn't know his name. My heart broke open with the fear that he was gone. Then the smoke shifted. And I saw the red tunic, torn and gray with dust, lying still on the grass. And on top of it, curled against it, safe, held alive. The little boy in the yellow t-shirt. I'm going to tell you what I saw when I got to them. And then I'm going to tell you what happened after, because the after matters just as much, maybe more. But first, the getting to them. My legs shouldn't have worked. I'm 71 and I'd been thrown to the ground by a bomb, but I got up. I don't know how. I told Poppy to stay by the railings. I said it hard. I said it in my old teacher voice, the one that stops a room. You stay right here. You do not move. Do you understand me? And she nodded, white-faced, and gripped the railings, and I turned and I went across that grass toward the red tunic as fast as my body could carry me. I wasn't the only one. That's the thing about people, about the herd. It runs away from danger, yes, but then, once the worst has happened, something turns it around. All across that torn-up space, people who had been running for their lives 90 seconds earlier were now running back, toward the smoke, toward the fallen. A dozen of them, 2 dozen. The man in the suit who'd known the smell. The teacher, her high-vis vest gray with dust, her students huddled safe behind her. The young mum, pram abandoned, sprinting. Strangers, all of them, running back into a place that had just tried to kill them, because someone might need help. I've never been prouder to be a person than I was in that moment. I want you to know that. In the worst thing I've ever seen, the very worst, the thing that made me proudest was watching frightened people turn around and run back. I reached the guard. He was on his side. The boy was tucked against his chest, and this is the part that undid me: the guard's arms were still around him, even unconscious. Even after being thrown that far, that hard, his arms hadn't let go. His body had curled instinctively around that child at the moment of the blast, and his arms had locked, and the boy was crying, alive, frightened, but alive, and barely marked, because a young man he'd never met had wrapped himself around him like a shell. I dropped to my knees. My hands were shaking so hard. The man in the suit was already there, and he was good, he was calm. He'd clearly done this before, some other life, some other war maybe. "Don't move him," he said to me. "His neck, don't move him, you. Take the boy gently, gently." I took the boy. I peeled him so carefully out of the guard's locked arms, and I held him. And he clung to me, this little stranger, arms around my neck, screaming for his mummy. And I said all the useless, beautiful things you say. "You're all right. I've got you. You're safe now, good boy, brave boy, I've got you." And I looked down at the guard. His eyes were open. Pale eyes, gray or washed-out blue. I'd wondered about that hours ago at the railings in another world. Now I knew, gray, open, blinking up at the smoke-filled sky, alive. He was hurt. Badly, I think. His leg was wrong, and there was blood, and the man in the suit was already barking at someone to call for help, tearing off his own jacket to press against a wound. But the guard was alive, and he was awake, and do you know what he did? He tried to get up. This boy, this broken boy on the grass, with a bomb blast still ringing in the air and his own blood on the grass, he tried to push himself up onto his elbow, and his eyes went not to his own wounds, not to the sky, not to me. His eyes went straight to the boy in my arms. The yellow t-shirt. And he looked, and he saw the boy was crying, which means breathing, which means alive, and something in his face just let go. This wave of relief so total it was almost holy. And he said, I had to lean in to hear it. His voice was a wreck, he said. "Is he all right?" That was his first question, not what happened, not am I dying, not help me. His first words, his first breath after all of it. "Is he all right?" I said, yes, I said, "He's all right, love, you saved him, he's all right, you did it." And this young man, this guardsman who had stood like a statue for hours and not flinched at a bee or a bead of sweat, who had held his face like carved stone in front of 10,000 tourists, his face crumpled. It just crumpled like Poppy's had when she dropped her ice cream, like a child's. And he cried. Lying there on the grass, bleeding, he put his dusty hand over his eyes and he cried out of relief, out of pain, out of the sheer unbearable humanness of what he'd just done. The man in the suit had a hand on his shoulder. "You're all right, son," he kept saying. "You're all right. Ambulance is coming. You did good. You did so good. Stay with me now." Part 3 continues. The mother, the crowd, the wait. The boy's mother found us maybe a minute later. I heard her before I saw her. That sound a mother makes. There's no other sound like it, and I'd know it anywhere. I made it once myself when Poppy's mother was small and I lost her for 90 seconds in a supermarket. It's not a word. It's older than words. It came tearing across the grass, this raw, ragged screaming of a name, Ollie, Ollie. And then she was there, this young woman, blood down the side of her own face, one shoe gone, her eyes wild and hunting, and she saw the yellow t-shirt in my arms and she made that sound again and she fell on us. I gave him to her. Of course I gave him to her. And she wrapped around him and sank down onto the grass and just held him and shook, both of them shaking, and she looked up at me, and she couldn't speak. She just looked, this look of a person who has been given back the thing they can't live without. I pointed at the guard. I said it wasn't me, it was him. He ran to Ollie, he carried him. He covered him when it went off, that's why Ollie's all right, it was him. She turned. She looked at the guard lying there in the dust and the blood, the man in the suit still pressing his jacket to the wound, and she understood. And she did something I'll never forget. Still holding her boy, she reached out with one hand and she took the guard's hand, his big dusty hand, lying open on the grass, and she gripped it, hard, and she couldn't say anything, she couldn't get a single word out. She just held his hand and looked at him and cried, and he looked back at her, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The oldest thanks there is. From a mother to the person who saved her child. He squeezed her hand. He didn't have much strength, but he squeezed it. And around us, London came apart and pulled together at the same time. I can only tell you what I saw from my little patch of grass. Sirens coming from everywhere now, that awful chorus building, police and ambulance and fire, that eaw echoing off the palace in the park. People in high-vis appearing from nowhere, taking charge, that particular calm that professionals bring. A paramedic dropping to her knees beside the guard, her hands quick and sure, saying his numbers out loud to her partner. The suited man finally standing up, his shirt soaked red, stumbling back, staring at his own hands. I found Poppy. She'd stayed by the railings, exactly where I'd told her, my brave girl, and when I reached her she flew at me and I held her and she sobbed into my chest, and I sobbed into her hair, and we just stood there, the two of us, in the dust and the smoke and the sirens, holding on. "Is the guard dead?" she asked me, muffled into my blouse. "No, love, he's hurt, but he's alive." "He wasn't a statue," she said. "No," I said, "he was never a statue. He was the bravest one." "Yes," I said, "he was the bravest one." They took him away on a stretcher. I watched. Half his uniform cut away by then, tubes and straps, and a paramedic jogging alongside holding a bag up high. And as they lifted him, as they carried him past where we stood, his eyes were open again and they moved, searching, and for 1 second, one single second, they found us. Me and Poppy. Or maybe he was looking for the boy. I don't know. But his eyes passed over us, and Poppy, my Poppy, she let go of me and she stood up as straight as she could, and she did the thing she'd seen the new guard do that morning, hours ago, in another life. She stood to attention. A 9-year-old girl, filthy with dust, tears cutting clean lines down her dirty face, standing to attention, saluting a soldier on a stretcher. I saw him see her. And I swear to you, I know how it sounds. I've told you I count things and imagine things, but I swear as they carried him past, that young man, wrecked and bleeding and barely conscious, lifted 2 fingers off the edge of the stretcher, just an inch, just enough, and touched his brow. He saluted her back. Then they were gone, into the back of the ambulance, and the doors shut, and it screamed away up the mall, and Poppy lowered her hand, and I picked her up. I don't know where I found the strength, but I picked my 9-year-old up like she was a toddler, and I carried her away from that place, and I didn't look back. I didn't know his name for 11 days. I know that number too. I keep the numbers. 11 days after the bomb, sitting in my kitchen in Leeds with the radio on, they said his name. He'd been in hospital the whole time. Serious but stable, they'd said, and then stable, and then, finally, recovering. And on the 11th day they released his name to the papers, along with a photograph, and I stood in my kitchen holding a tea towel, and I looked at the face of the young man I'd watched hold so still, and I finally knew what to call him. I'm not going to give you his full name here. His family asked in the end for a bit of privacy, and I'll honor that, because they've been through enough and he'd want me too. But I'll tell you, he was 22 years old. 22. He joined up at 18, straight out of a little town I'd never heard of. His mum was a nurse. His dad drove a lorry. He was, by every account, an unremarkable young man, decent, quiet, liked his football, had a girlfriend, was saving up for a car. Ordinary, completely ordinary. Until 11 minutes past 11 on a hot Friday in June, when he became the least ordinary person I have ever seen. The papers, of course, went wild. You'll have seen the headlines, guard hero, the soldier who wouldn't run, all of that. And it's true, all of it, but headlines flatten things, don't they? They take a real living, breathing boy who cried on the grass and asked, "Is he all right?" before anything else, and they turn him into a poster, a symbol. I understand why. People needed a symbol that week. London was frightened and grieving because people did die that day. I haven't dwelt on that, but they did. And I won't pretend they didn't, and I think about them too, and in the middle of all that fear, people needed something to hold on to that was good. And he was good. So he became the thing everyone held on to. But I knew something the headlines didn't. I knew about the 11 steps. I knew about the bearskin hat tumbling onto the grass and how young he looked without it. I knew his arms didn't let go even when he was unconscious. I knew his first words. And I knew about the salute, the 2 fingers lifted off the stretcher for a 9-year-old girl. That was never in any paper. That was ours, mine and Poppy's. We kept it. Now let me tell you about the investigation briefly, because people always ask. They worked out afterward what he'd seen. The van had been parked over an hour, but in the last few minutes before it went up, apparently the driver who'd walked away and left it had done something, some small wrong thing, some detail. And the guard from his post, with his eyes fixed on that far point the way they're trained, had a clear sightline to that corner. He'd noticed the van when it arrived. He'd noticed it didn't fit. And in those final moments he'd seen or smelled or sensed the thing that turned wrong into certain. And he'd made a decision that broke every rule he'd ever been given. He left his post twice, once to warn us, once to save a child. And here's the part that I think about most, lying awake some nights. By the rules, the strict, sacred, unbending rules of his job, leaving his post was wrong. He wasn't supposed to do it. Everything in his training said stand, hold, stay. If he'd followed the rules to the letter, he'd have stood at those railings and done nothing and been blameless, and Ollie would be dead, and God knows how many others, because his shouting cleared that space in the seconds that mattered. He broke the rules to keep the promise underneath the rules. Because the rules were never really the point, were they? The standing still, the not flinching, the discipline, that was never the job. That was just the training for the job. The actual job, the real one, the one underneath, was this. When the moment comes, you put your body between the people and the harm. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else is buttons and boots and bearskin hats. 41 buttons. I counted them that morning, when the worst thing that could happen was a bee landing on his nose. Part 4 continues, the reunion, and the last thing I have to tell you. I met him again, once. I should tell you about that, and then I'm nearly done. It was months later, the autumn. There was a small private thing, not one of the big official ceremonies with the cameras, but a quieter gathering, for the people who'd been there that day and the families. Ollie's mum tracked me down. She'd never forgotten the old woman who'd held her boy, and she wanted me there, and she paid for the train, and Poppy came too, because Poppy would not have been left behind. Not for anything, not for the world. And he was there. He walked with a stick now. He'd lost some of the movement in one leg, and they'd told him, gently, that he wouldn't be able to serve the same way again, and I could see what that cost him in his face, this boy for whom the uniform had meant everything. But he was up, and he was walking, and he was alive. And when he came into that room, the whole place went quiet, and then everyone stood up, all at once, without anyone saying to, and he went red. This bright, embarrassed red, because he hated the fuss. You could tell he hated the fuss. Ollie ran to him. Of course. That little boy, bigger now, steadier on his legs, ran across the room and wrapped himself around the guard's good leg, and the guard reached down and put his hand on that small head, the way he had on the grass, cradling it, and he closed his eyes for a second, and I had to look away because it was too much. It was just too much. I got to speak to him near the end, Poppy and me. I told him I was the woman with the little girl at the railings. His face changed. He remembered. You were counting, he said. I saw you. You had your granddaughter and your lips were moving. I thought you were praying. Counting, I said. I count when I'm frightened. He nodded slowly. I count too, he said. In my head on the post to stay still, I count. And we looked at each other. This old woman from Leeds and this young broken soldier. 2 people who count to hold the world still. And I don't think I've ever felt so understood by a stranger in all my life. Poppy tugged his sleeve. She'd been building up to something, I could tell. And she said in her clear little voice the thing she'd been carrying for months. I thought you were a statue. At the start, I'm sorry. I thought you weren't real. And he crouched down. It hurt him too. I could see it. He braced on his stick. He got right down to her level. And he said, very seriously, the way you should always talk to a child who said something serious. I'm glad you thought that. That means I was doing it right. Then he almost smiled. But you were right in the end, weren't you? I wasn't a statue. No, Poppy said, you were the bravest one. And he looked at her and something moved behind those gray eyes and he said quietly, so were you. You stood to attention. On the stretcher I saw you. That's the thing I remember most, do you know that? Out of the whole day, a little girl standing to attention. He tapped his own brow, the two fingers, the way he had on the stretcher. I've thought about that 100 times. It kept me going some of the bad nights. That salute. Poppy's chin wobbled. And then right there in that quiet room she did it again, stood up straight, saluted. And he stood up, it took him a moment, the stick, the leg, but he stood up all the way to his full height, this tall young man in his ordinary clothes, and he saluted her back. Properly this time. Not two fingers off a stretcher. A full, straight-backed, perfect salute, held the way he'd been trained, the way he'd stood for hours at those golden railings on the last morning the world was simple. I counted the seconds he held it. I couldn't help it. 11. He held that salute for 11 seconds, for a 9-year-old girl. And then he lowered his hand, and Poppy lowered hers, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything left to say. So that's my story. That's the whole of it, as true as I can tell it. People ask me sometimes what I learned that day, as if a thing that terrible ought to come with a lesson tied to it like a bow. And I never quite know what to say, because mostly what I learned is that the world can end at 11 minutes past 11 on a beautiful morning while a child makes a wish. And there's no lesson in that. There's just the terror of it. But there's this too, and this is the thing I hold on to on the nights I count myself to sleep. I learned that the steady ones, the quiet ones, the ones who stand so still you think they're not even real, the ones we walk past and photograph and don't think twice about, I learned that they're not standing still because they're stone. They're standing still because they're holding something up, holding the whole ordinary, lovely world up, so the rest of us can lick our ice creams and make our wishes and never once know how close it all comes, every single day, to falling. He wasn't a statue. My granddaughter was right in the end. He was a young man who counted to stay still, and when the moment came, he stopped counting and he moved. And 41 brass buttons couldn't hold him to his post, but a child's cry could pull him off it. That's the bravest thing I ever saw, and I'll tell it to anyone who will listen for as long as I've got a voice to tell it with.